I think my best friend is in love with my wife, and her responses deeply worry me. My lifelong best friend Jerry has always found my wife Rachel attractive. He used to joke that if I wasn't in the picture, he'd pursue her immediately. I took it as a compliment until it became constant. 6 months ago, I confronted him. "Do you actually have feelings for Rachel?" "You're my boy," he said. She's almost irresistible, but I'd never crossed that line. 1 month later, he was telling her directly. We were drinking at our house when Jerry looked Rachel up and down. "Jake's a lucky man because, wow." "Knock it off," I told him. Rachel just laughed. "Don't be so serious, Jake." The next time he came over, he did it again. Rachel laughed and said, "Your girlfriend Sarah must be equally lucky." They both laughed while I watched my best friend flirt with my wife as she reciprocated. A month later, I discovered Jerry had sent Rachel gym progress pics. A text popped up while we were looking at her phone. She quickly hid it, but I'd seen him flexing shirtless, her responding with heart eyes emojis. "It's nothing," she convinced me. We went on a double date, ended up at our house for drinks. Jerry and Rachel went to smoke in the backyard. "Can we join?" Sarah and I asked. "Private chat," Rachel said, closing the door. More instances followed, constant texting, inside jokes, playful touches. Yesterday came the slap. I saw an email on Rachel's laptop, hotel booking confirmation. Next weekend. 2 people, Rachel and Jerry. Same room, but oddly, 2 single beds. That evening, I tested her. "Want to visit my parents next weekend?" "Can't. Going to Jessica's birthday out of state." She lied without hesitation. Saturday morning, Rachel left. "See you Monday, babe." I followed using GPS tracker on her car. She drove to a hotel 30 minutes away, not out of state. Jerry arrived separately. They hugged too long, then went inside. I waited an hour, then went to the front desk. My wife forgot her medication. "Room 214, the clerk said. At the door, I heard laughter, Rachel's giggle, Jerry's voice, but also another woman's voice. I knocked. Jerry answered. Rachel sat on one bed fully clothed. On the other sat Sarah, and a woman I'd never seen. "Jake? What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same." "Come in," Jerry said. The room had birthday decorations, a cake, wrapped presents. "We need to talk about your blackouts," Sarah said. "My what?" "The nights you don't remember," Jerry said. "The conversations you forget." "I don't have blackouts." The stranger stood. "I'm Dr. Harrison, psychiatrist. Your wife asked me here." "Why?" Rachel was crying. "Jake, you've been having dissociative episodes. You become someone else." "That's ridiculous." Jerry pulled out his phone. "Remember when you accused me of flirting with Rachel?" "You were. You became convinced you were me. You sent her those gym photos from my phone when you borrowed it." "Impossible." Dr. Harrison spoke gently. "Dissociative identity disorder. Sometimes people create alternate personalities based on people they know. You're saying I think I'm Jerry?" "Not think," Rachel said. "Become. You literally believe you're him. Last week you tried to kiss me and said, 'Come on, Rachel.' Jake doesn't have to know." Sarah handed me a folder. These messages between Jerry and Rachel. Check the times against Jerry's actual location. His phone was at work. The messages came from your phone. I stared at the evidence. "The hotel booking?" I asked weakly. "For an intervention," Rachel said. 2 beds for Dr. Harrison and Sarah. "But you lied. Because when I bring up your episodes, you become aggressive. Or you switch." "Switch?" "Into the Jerry personality," Dr. Harrison explained. "How long?" 6 months, Rachel said, "since your father's death." "My father. The accident. Our last conversation being an argument. I remember things differently." "That's the disorder. Your mind rewrites memories." Jerry sat beside me. "You called me 2 nights ago at 3 a.m. crying, saying you were losing your mind. You begged for help. You don't remember?" I didn't. Rachel knelt before me. "There's something else. Something we discovered researching your condition." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping. "Local boy, 8, only survivor of family murder-suicide." The photo showed a young boy who looked exactly like me at that age. But the name wasn't Jake Stevens. It was Jerry Williams. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Jake," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "we believe your condition started much earlier than 6 months ago. We think it began when you were 8. I don't understand. Rachel held my hands. The boy in this photo, Jerry Williams, witnessed his father kill his mother and sister before killing himself. The trauma was so severe that the boy created a new identity, Jake Stevens. But Jerry is right here. I turned to Jerry, but he was gone. So was Sarah. Only Dr. Harrison and Rachel remained. Where did they go? Rachel was crying harder. Jake, Jerry has been dead for 20 years. He died in the murder-suicide with his family. But I've known him since college. You've known the personality you created. You are Jerry Williams. You survived that night and became Jake Stevens to escape the trauma. That's insane. I have memories, a whole life. Dr. Harrison nodded. Created to protect yourself. But stress triggers the original personality, Jerry, to resurface. My phone buzzed. A text from Jerry. Stop fighting it. You know I'm real. Rachel saw it. Jake, that's your second phone. The one you use when you're Jerry. I looked at my hand. 2 phones. I stared at both phones, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Rachel reached over and gently took them from my shaking hands. She opened the messaging apps on each phone and held them side by side. The conversations were identical, word for word. Messages to her about meeting up, compliments about how she looked, suggestions about getting together without me knowing. The timestamps showed they were sent at the same times, but from different numbers. One phone was mine, the one I carried every day. The other looked exactly like it but had a different case. Rachel scrolled through weeks of messages I had no memory of sending. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe right. She showed me photos I'd apparently sent her, gym selfies that looked like they came from someone else's phone. But they came from mine. Dr. Harrison moved closer and put a hand on my shoulder. She suggested we go to the hospital right away for a full check. She explained that when someone has these kinds of episodes, they can get worse without help. She said, dissociative disorders can be dangerous if they're not treated. I wanted to say no, to tell them they were wrong, to insist this was all some kind of setup. But I couldn't explain the phones. I couldn't explain the messages. I couldn't explain why Rachel had been tracking my behavior for months without me noticing. The evidence sat right there in front of me, and I had no way to argue against it. Something was seriously wrong with me, and denying it wouldn't make it go away. The hospital admitted me to the psychiatric unit within an hour of our arrival. A woman at the intake desk asked me basic questions about my name, my age, where I lived, who my emergency contact was. Each question made me more scared because I didn't know which answers were true anymore. Was I really Jake Stevens? Had I made that name up? The woman asked about my parents, and I started to answer before stopping myself. Were those memories real? Did I actually have the childhood I remembered? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely sign the admission forms. Rachel stood next to me the whole time, answering questions when I couldn't. I noticed she'd brought a thick folder with her, stuffed full of papers. She handed it to the intake coordinator, who flipped through page after page. Rachel had been documenting everything, times I didn't remember, conversations I had no memory of having, changes in my behavior she'd witnessed over the past 6 months. She'd written down dates and details, kept copies of text messages, even recorded some of our conversations on her phone. The folder showed months of careful tracking, proof that she'd known something was wrong long before tonight. I felt betrayed and grateful at the same time. She'd been watching me like I was a stranger, but she'd also been trying to help me. They put me in a small room with a bed, a chair, and a window with bars on it. The first night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember my childhood as Jake Stevens. The memories came easily. My 5th birthday party with the red and blue balloons, playing soccer in middle school. My first girlfriend in high school, Sarah Mitchell, who broke up with me before prom. Learning to drive in my mom's old sedan. Starting college, meeting my roommate, joining the debate team. Everything felt real and solid and true. But Dr. Harrison's words kept playing in my head. She'd said that constructed memories could feel completely real. She'd explained that the brain was incredibly good at filling in gaps, at creating false histories that felt authentic. I tried to focus on specific details from my memories. What did my childhood house look like? I could picture a 2-story building with white siding and a big front porch. But when I tried to remember the inside, the layout seemed wrong. The kitchen was in different places depending on which memory I accessed. My bedroom was upstairs in some memories and downstairs in others. The more I focused, the more the details shifted and blurred. I remembered my parents' faces, but they seemed fuzzy, like photographs that had been copied too many times. I remembered friends from elementary school, but I couldn't recall any of their last names or specific conversations we'd had. The memories felt real in the moment, but fell apart when I examined them closely. A doctor came to see me the next morning. He introduced himself as a neurologist and explained he needed to run some tests. He wanted to rule out physical problems that might cause memory issues. Brain tumors, he said, seizures, strokes, other medical conditions that could explain what was happening. Part of me hoped they'd find something. A tumor would be terrible, but at least it would be fixable. At least it would mean my entire life wasn't a lie. They did an MRI, sticking me in a loud machine for what felt like hours. They did blood tests, checking for infections or chemical imbalances. They hooked me up to an EEG, placing electrodes all over my head to measure my brain activity. The neurologist had me do cognitive tests, answering questions and solving puzzles. He checked my reflexes, my coordination, my ability to track objects with my eyes. Every test came back normal. My brain was physically healthy. No tumors, no lesions, no signs of seizures or strokes. My blood work showed nothing unusual. The EEG patterns were typical. The neurologist told me this was actually good news, but it didn't feel good. It meant the problem was psychological, not medical. It meant Dr. Harrison was probably right about the dissociative disorder. Dr. Harrison came to see me after the test results came back. She sat down across from me and explained that the normal results actually supported her diagnosis. She said my brain was physically fine, but psychologically broken from childhood trauma I couldn't remember. She used words like fragmented and compartmentalized, explaining that my mind had split itself into pieces to protect me from something unbearable. The Jake Stevens identity, she said, was a protective shell I'd built around the real me. The Jerry personality that had been emerging was the original me trying to break through. She asked if I was ready to start working through this, to figure out what was real and what wasn't. I didn't feel ready, but I nodded anyway. We scheduled our first real therapy session for the next day. That night, I tried again to remember my earliest memories. I focused on my 5th birthday, the memory I'd always thought of as my first clear recollection. I could see the backyard, the picnic table covered with a plastic tablecloth, the cake with 5 candles. But as I focused on the details, things started to feel wrong. The house in the background didn't match other memories of my childhood home. The people at the party had blurry faces, like extras in a movie. I couldn't remember a single present I'd received that day, couldn't recall what the cake tasted like, couldn't remember any specific conversations or games we'd played. The memory felt like a photograph I'd seen, rather than something I'd actually experienced. The next morning, Dr. Harrison asked me to describe that 5th birthday memory in detail. I started talking, trying to make the pieces fit together. She listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific details. What color was the tablecloth? Who else was there? What kind of cake was it? With each question, I realized how little I actually remembered. The tablecloth changed colors as I talked about it. The people at the party shifted from neighbors to relatives to friends I couldn't name. The cake was chocolate, then vanilla, then something else. Dr. Harrison pointed out gently that the details kept changing as I spoke. She explained that real memories tend to be stable and consistent, even if they're not perfect. False memories, she said, often shift and change because the brain is making them up on the spot. I felt sick. She asked about other early memories and the same thing happened. The more I talked, the less solid anything became. Details contradicted each other. Timelines didn't make sense. People appeared in memories from times before I could have known them. My entire childhood felt like it was dissolving as I examined it. Rachel came to the session after lunch. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well either. Dr. Harrison asked her to share what she'd discovered about my past. Rachel pulled out more papers from her folder and explained that she'd contacted someone named Quentin Burke. She said I'd always talked about Quentin as my college roommate, my best friend from freshman year. Rachel had found him on social media and called him. Quentin remembered me, she said, but he was confused by many of the stories I'd told about our time together. According to Quentin, we'd lived in different dorms. We'd had different majors. We'd hung out sometimes but weren't actually that close. Many of the adventures I remembered having with Quentin, he said he'd never experienced. Some of them had happened to other people he knew, but not to him and me together. Rachel showed me printed messages from Quentin, polite, but clearly puzzled about why I remembered things so differently than he did. I insisted Quentin had to be wrong. Maybe he was misremembering. Maybe he was confusing me with someone else. But Rachel gently pulled out more papers. She'd asked Quentin to send photos from college, pictures that included me. She spread them out on the table between us. I was in the photos, definitely me, younger, but recognizable. But everything else was wrong. The pictures showed me in a dorm I didn't remember living in, wearing a jacket from a sports team I'd never joined, standing with people I couldn't name. In one photo, I was holding a trophy for something I had no memory of winning. Rachel pointed to a picture of me at what looked like a debate tournament. I'd always told her I was on the debate team in college, that it was a huge part of my life. But in this photo, I was sitting in the audience, not competing. Another photo showed me at a party in an apartment I didn't recognize. The furniture, the people, the whole setting felt foreign. Rachel asked me to tell her about these moments, these specific captured times. I couldn't. I had no memory of any of these events actually happening. Dr. Harrison set down the folder and looked at me with calm eyes. She explained how my brain worked to protect me from things too painful to handle. The mind builds stories, she said, complete ones with details that feel absolutely real. These false memories don't seem fake to the person experiencing them. They come with emotions, with sensory details, with the same feeling of truth that real memories carry. My brain filled in gaps, she explained, creating an entire childhood for someone who never existed. Every birthday party, every friend, every moment I remembered as Jake Stevens might have been constructed piece by piece to hide the truth about Jerry Williams. The process happened automatically, she said, outside conscious awareness. My mind needed Jake Stevens to survive, so it gave him a complete history that felt as solid as anything real. Over the following days, Dr. Harrison brought notebooks and timelines to our sessions. She asked me to write down specific memories from different ages. 5th birthday, first day of school, learning to ride a bike, family vacations. I filled pages with details that felt completely true. Then she compared my memories to actual records. My 5th birthday happened in a house that county records showed my family never lived in. The school I remembered attending had no record of a student named Jake Stevens during those years. The vacation I described happened 2 years before the date I remembered, and my family couldn't have been there based on other documented events. Each session revealed more problems with the life I thought I'd lived. Dates shifted, locations didn't match, people remembered things differently than I did. Dr. Harrison showed me yearbook photos where I appeared in clubs I had no memory of joining. She presented attendance records that contradicted my memories of where I'd been. The evidence mounted day after day, each piece chipping away at the foundation of everything I believed about myself. Rachel arrived on the 4th day carrying a manila envelope. She looked tired, older somehow, like this process was aging her in real time. She sat across from me and pulled out a document with an official seal. My actual birth certificate, she said quietly, retrieved from county records after days of searching through archives. She slid it across the table. The paper felt heavy in my hands. Jerry Anthony Williams, born August 15th. Parents listed as Robert Williams and Catherine Williams. Birth location matched the hospital from the newspaper clipping. The date of birth aligned perfectly with the age of the boy in that photo. Every detail confirmed what I didn't want to believe. I stared at the names, at the official stamps, at the proof that Jake Stevens had never been born because he never existed. Rachel pulled out more documents. Death certificates for Robert, Catherine, and Jennifer Williams. All dated the same day, 20 years ago. Foster care records for Jerry Williams, showing placements in 3 different homes over 4 years before the records just stopped around age 12. Right when Jake Stevens would have appeared. I pushed the papers away, my hands shaking. This had to be fake, I told Rachel. Someone planted these documents, created this elaborate setup to make me think I was crazy. Maybe she was part of it. Maybe Dr. Harrison was too. The words came out desperate and angry. Rachel's face crumpled and she started crying. Dr. Harrison spoke calmly, explaining that denial was normal when dissociative barriers began breaking down. The mind protected itself by rejecting evidence that threatened the constructed identity. She'd seen this response in other patients. The anger, the accusations of conspiracy, the insistence that documented proof must be fabricated. It was part of the process, she said. My brain was fighting to maintain Jake Stevens because letting him go felt like dying. She asked me to consider why multiple sources would all conspire to create the same false story. County records, newspaper archives, foster care files, college documentation. All of it would have to be manufactured and planted years ago. Did that seem more likely than the explanation she'd given me? I wanted to argue, but couldn't find the logic to support my accusations. That night, sleep came hard and brought nightmares worse than anything I'd experienced before. I found myself in a house I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Dark hallways stretched in directions that didn't make sense. The walls were the wrong color, covered in old wallpaper that triggered something deep in my memory. I heard shouting from downstairs, a man's voice getting louder and angrier with each word, a woman crying, begging, then a child screaming, high and terrified. Footsteps pounded on stairs. I was hiding somewhere small and dark, my child-sized body pressed against wooden walls. The smell of mothballs and old clothes surrounded me. More shouting, closer now. The woman's voice cut off suddenly. Then came sounds I couldn't identify at first, sharp and loud, echoing through the house. The child's screaming stopped. Silence fell, heavy and wrong. I tried to stay quiet in my hiding place, but my breathing sounded too loud. Another sharp sound, different this time. Something heavy hitting the floor. I woke up screaming, my voice hoarse and desperate. The night nurse rushed in, calling for help. They had to hold me down while I thrashed and fought, still half in the nightmare. Eventually, they gave me something that made the world go soft and distant. Dr. Harrison visited early the next morning. She sat beside my bed and asked me to describe the nightmare in detail. I told her everything I could remember. She listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she explained that nightmares like mine often carried actual memories trying to surface. The brain stored traumatic experiences differently than normal memories. Sometimes they emerged in fragments during sleep when conscious defenses were down. The house I'd described matched the layout of the Williams family home, according to police reports from that night. The sounds I'd heard aligned with what happened. She suggested hypnotherapy as a way to access these memories safely, in a controlled environment where she could guide me through them without the overwhelming terror of nightmares. I told her I was scared of what I might remember. She nodded, saying that fear was valid. These memories contained the worst moments of my life. But living in denial while they surfaced uncontrollably might be worse than facing them directly with professional support. Rachel came to visit later that afternoon. She'd been coming every day since my admission, but today she looked different. The strain showed in her face, in the way she sat without quite meeting my eyes. We talked about small things at first, avoiding the big questions. Then I asked her directly if she was going to leave me. She started crying before she could answer. She said she didn't know how to respond to that question. She'd married Jake Stevens, built a life with him, loved him for years. Now she was learning that person might not truly exist the way she'd believed. She didn't know how to separate the man she loved from the identity that was apparently constructed. Did she love me, Jerry Williams? Or did she love the Jake Stevens personality I'd created? She couldn't tell anymore. The uncertainty was tearing her apart. She promised she wasn't abandoning me, that she wanted to stay and help me through this. But she also had to be honest that she didn't know what their marriage meant anymore or who she was actually married to. The next day brought visitors I hadn't expected. Quentin walked into my room with a woman I recognized from photos, his wife, whose name I suddenly couldn't remember with certainty. They both smiled, but the smiles looked uncomfortable, forced. Quentin sat in the chair beside my bed while his wife stood near the door like she might need to leave quickly. They asked how I was doing, standard questions that didn't require real answers. I could see them trying to reconcile the person they'd known with whatever Rachel had told them about my situation. The awkwardness hung heavy in the room. Quentin mentioned that Rachel had explained some of what was happening. He said they wanted to come support me, but also weren't sure what to say. His wife nodded agreement. I appreciated them coming, I told them, even though this whole thing was strange and uncomfortable for everyone. Quentin laughed, a short, nervous sound, and said that was putting it mildly. Quentin started sharing stories from college, trying to help fill in gaps in my memory. He talked about times when I'd apparently had episodes even back then, moments when I seemed confused about basic facts of my own life. Once I'd told him about growing up in Colorado, but the next week I'd talked about childhood memories from Ohio. He'd assumed I'd just misspoken, or he'd misheard. Another time I'd gotten angry when he mentioned something we'd supposedly done together freshman year, insisting that never happened. He'd thought I was just quirky, maybe forgetful, possibly dealing with stress. Now he understood those moments were signs of something more serious. He'd noticed other strange things too. Times when I'd seemed like a completely different person, more aggressive or withdrawn than usual. Days when I'd avoid him for no apparent reason, then act like nothing had happened. He'd written it off as normal college behavior, everyone dealing with their own stuff. He said he felt guilty now for not recognizing something was wrong. His wife spoke up from her position near the door. She reminded me of a specific incident from junior year. I'd told her about my parents dying when I was young, got emotional talking about growing up without them. The next day at a group dinner, I'd casually mentioned calling my mom about something. She'd been confused and asked about the contradiction. I'd gotten immediately angry, she said, defensive and hostile. Told her she'd misunderstood what I'd said before. Then I'd avoided her for weeks, refusing to acknowledge her at social gatherings. She'd thought I was just being difficult or embarrassed about oversharing. Looking back now, she recognized it as something more significant. The person who'd talked about dead parents and the person who'd mentioned calling his mom were probably two different identities, she said carefully. She could see that now. I sat there in the hospital room, staring at Quentin and Fiona as they packed up their things to leave. The folder of evidence sat on the bed beside me, thick with documents I didn't want to look at anymore. Rachel walked them to the door, thanking them quietly for coming all this way. When she came back, she sat in the chair next to my bed and didn't say anything for a long time. I kept thinking about the stories Quentin told, the ones where I'd apparently contradicted myself about basic facts of my life. Colorado versus Ohio. Dead parents versus calling my mom. The memories felt so real in my head, but the evidence said they couldn't all be true. Something in me started cracking, like ice breaking up on a frozen lake. Maybe Jake Stevens wasn't who I thought he was. Maybe he was just a story I'd been telling myself for so long that I believed it. But I still couldn't remember being Jerry Williams, couldn't access any clear memories of that 8-year-old boy who survived his family being killed. The gap between who I thought I was and who I apparently am felt impossible to cross. Dr. Harrison came back the next morning with someone new. She introduced him as Lester, another patient on the unit who'd agreed to talk with me. Lester looked normal, maybe 40, wearing jeans and a hospital shirt like mine. We sat in the common room while Dr. Harrison watched from nearby. Lester told me he'd been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder 5 years ago after his wife noticed he kept losing time and acting like different people. He'd created 3 separate identities to cope with abuse he suffered as a kid, each one handling different types of stress. For years, he'd switch between them without realizing it, each identity thinking they were the only real person. The therapy process took 2 years, he said, but now he'd integrated all the parts of himself into one whole person. He still remembered being the different identities, but he understood they were all aspects of him, rather than separate people. Hearing him talk about it made something loosen in my chest. He seemed okay, functional, like someone who'd come through something terrible and survived. If he could do it, maybe I could too. Maybe I wouldn't lose myself completely in this process. Maybe there was a version of me on the other side that was whole instead of fractured. The next day, Dr. Harrison started what she called trauma-focused therapy. She explained we'd work on accessing the memories from the night my family died, but we'd do it slowly and safely. The first session, she just had me sit quietly and notice what came up when I thought about being 8 years old. Nothing came at first, just blankness and a weird feeling of panic. Then she asked me to imagine a house, any house from my childhood. An image flashed through my mind, dark hallways and closed doors, but it disappeared before I could hold on to it. Over the next several days, we kept trying. The memories came in pieces, fragments that didn't connect to anything. A blue carpet, the smell of something burning, a woman's voice singing. None of it made sense or formed a complete picture. Dr. Harrison said this was normal, that traumatic memories get stored differently than regular ones. They come back in flashes and feelings instead of clear narratives. Each session left me exhausted, like I'd been running for miles. My head would ache and I'd feel nauseous. Rachel visited every afternoon and I'd tell her about the fragments, trying to make sense of them. Then one night, I had the dream. I was small, hiding in a dark space that smelled like clothes and shoes. A closet. Outside the door, I could hear my father's voice getting louder and angrier, shouting words I couldn't make out. My mother was crying, begging him to stop. Then my sister screamed, a sound that went right through me. More shouting. A loud bang that made the walls shake. Another bang. Then silence that felt worse than the noise. I stayed in the closet, pressed against the back wall, too scared to move or make any sound. The dream was so vivid I could feel the carpet under my knees, smell the fear sweat on my skin. When I woke up, I was shaking and crying, and the night nurse had to give me something to calm down. But the memory felt different from my Jake Stevens memories. It was rawer, more real, like something that had actually happened to my body instead of a story I'd been told. Dr. Harrison said the next morning that this was a breakthrough, that my mind was finally letting me access what really happened. The memory terrified me, but part of me also felt relief. At least it was real. At least it was mine. Rachel came that afternoon with boxes from our house. She'd brought photo albums, old documents, things I'd kept for years in storage. We spread everything out on my bed and started going through it. My high school yearbook showed a kid who looked like me but seemed somehow off, like he was performing being a teenager. College photos had the same quality, like I was playing a role. But what struck me most was what wasn't there. No baby pictures, no elementary school photos. Nothing from before age 12 except a few blurry snapshots that could have been anyone. Dr. Harrison came in while we were looking and pointed this out as significant. Most people have boxes of childhood stuff, she said. Photos, report cards, toys they kept. I had almost nothing. Rachel pulled out my birth certificate, the one she'd gotten from county records. Jerry Williams, born to Robert and Catherine Williams, survived by none. The document felt heavy in my hands, more real than any of the Jake Stevens paperwork I'd been carrying around for years. Rachel went back to our storage unit the next day and came back with something I'd never seen before. A small metal box, locked, that she'd found hidden behind other boxes in the back corner. She'd had to break the lock to open it. Inside were things that made my stomach drop. Drawings made by a child, stick figures of a family with the name Jerry written in crayon at the top. A school ID card from Riverside Elementary with my face, maybe 7 years old, but the name said Jerry Williams. Letters from social workers discussing placement options for a traumatized boy who wouldn't speak. A newspaper clipping, the same one Rachel had shown me before but with more details. The article described how Robert Williams had shot his wife Catherine and daughter Jennifer before turning the gun on himself, how 8-year-old Jerry had been found hiding in a closet 12 hours later. I held the school ID and stared at the face looking back at me. That was me. That was actually me. Not Jake Stevens with his made-up childhood and fake memories. Me. Sitting there with all the evidence spread around me, I couldn't deny it anymore. The drawings were in my handwriting, the child version of the way I still wrote. The school ID showed my face with a gap in my front teeth I'd had fixed at age 13. The social worker letters described behaviors I vaguely remembered, refusing to talk, hiding in small spaces, violent nightmares. I was Jerry Williams. I'd survived that night in the closet while my family died, and then sometime around age 12, I'd created Jake Stevens to escape from it. Made up parents who loved me and never hurt anyone. Made up a childhood without trauma or fear. Built a whole identity from nothing because being Jerry Williams was too painful to bear. The acceptance hit me like a wave, bringing both relief and grief. Relief, because at least now I knew the truth, knew what was real. But grief for Jake Stevens, for the life I thought I'd lived, for the person I thought I was. That person never existed. He was just a story, just a protective shell I'd built around the scared 8-year-old boy who watched his family die. Dr. Harrison came in and found me crying over the box of items. She sat down and let me cry for a while before speaking. When I could talk again, I told her I understood now, that I accepted I was Jerry Williams. She nodded and said this was a crucial step, but it was important to understand what it meant. Integration wasn't about killing off Jake Stevens, she explained. Jake wasn't a separate person who needed to die. He was always part of me, a protective aspect of my personality that helped me survive when I had no other way to cope. The goal wasn't to destroy Jake, but to accept that Jake and Jerry were both me, different parts of the same person. The adult life I'd lived as Jake Stevens was real, she said. The feelings, the relationships, the experiences, those all actually happened to me. The only thing that wasn't real was the childhood history I'd constructed to support the Jake identity. I could keep the good parts of Jake while accepting the truth about Jerry. That's what integration meant. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked on bringing together my memories and identity. Dr. Harrison had me write down everything I remembered as Jake Stevens, then everything I was starting to remember as Jerry Williams. We looked for places where they connected, where one identity ended and the other began. The process was exhausting. Each session left me drained and confused, struggling to hold both truths in my head at once. I'd remember Jake's first day of high school, then realize that memory was false, constructed from TV shows and books I'd read. Then I'd remember Jerry's real first day at a new school after being placed with a foster family, feeling terrified and alone. Separating the real memories from the constructed ones felt like untangling two chains that had been twisted together for decades. Some days I'd make progress and feel like I understood myself better. Other days I'd backslide and insist again that Jake was real, that all of this was a mistake. Rachel came to one of the sessions, and Dr. Harrison had us talk about how my integration affected our relationship. Rachel admitted she was struggling with her own crisis about who I was. She'd fallen in love with Jake Stevens, married him, built a life with him, but Jake was never fully real. How could she trust her feelings when the person she'd loved was partly a construct? I told her the only thing I knew for sure was that my love for her was real. Jake's feelings were my feelings. The identity might have been false, but the emotions weren't. I'd genuinely fallen in love with her, genuinely wanted to marry her, genuinely built a life with her. That was all real, all me, regardless of what name I was using or what childhood I thought I'd had. She started crying and said she needed time to process everything. She wasn't leaving, but she needed space to figure out who I actually was now, who we were together. I understood. I needed the same thing. I went back to our apartment that night and slept in the guest room. Rachel didn't push it. The next morning, she made breakfast like always, but we ate in silence. I kept looking at her across the table, trying to see if she was real or just another piece of my broken mind. She caught me staring and reached across to touch my hand. Her fingers felt solid and warm. That had to mean something. Dr. Harrison scheduled me for sessions 3 times a week. During the second week, something shifted in my head while I was sitting in her office. She was asking me about my 8th birthday, trying to help me separate real memories from fake ones. I started describing the party Jake Stevens had, the one with the bounce house and pizza, but halfway through another memory pushed in. Same age, same time of year, but different. A small cake on a kitchen table, my mother singing, my sister making faces at me, my father in the corner, not singing, just watching with empty eyes. I could hold both memories at once, see them side by side like photos. The Jake version felt smooth and perfect, like a story I'd read in a book. The Jerry version had rough edges, smelled like vanilla frosting, made my chest hurt. I told Dr. Harrison what was happening and she leaned forward. She said this was progress, that my mind was starting to integrate instead of keeping everything separate. The disorientation would pass as I got used to holding both truths at the same time. I left that session feeling dizzy, but also lighter somehow. Quentin showed up at the hospital the following week. Rachel had called him, asked if he'd visit. I was in the common area when he arrived, and for a second I almost didn't recognize him. Then he smiled, and it clicked. We'd been roommates sophomore year. Or I thought we had. Now I wasn't sure what was real. We sat in plastic chairs by the window. He asked how I was doing, and I gave him some generic answer. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. Then he said something that stuck with me. He told me that back in college, he'd always felt like I was performing. Not in a fake way exactly, but like I was playing a role I'd memorized really well. He said everyone else seemed to buy it completely, but he'd catch these moments where I'd slip and seem confused about my own life. Like once I'd told a story about my high school graduation, and the next day I couldn't remember which story I'd told. He'd thought I was just forgetful, or maybe smoking too much. Now it made sense. He said the person I was becoming now seemed more real, even though I was clearly struggling. He could see me actually thinking about my answers instead of just reciting them. It was the first time someone had told me that integration might actually make me more authentic instead of less. Dr. Harrison reduced my medication during week 3. She explained that the pills I'd been taking weren't really for psychosis or delusions. I wasn't schizophrenic. I was traumatized. The medication had just been helping me stay calm while we worked through everything. She said dissociation was a survival mechanism, not a mental illness. My brain had done exactly what it needed to do to keep me alive after watching my family die. Now that I was stable and starting to integrate, I didn't need as much chemical help. The lower dose made everything feel sharper. Colors seemed brighter. Sounds were clearer. I could think faster, but also felt more raw, like I'd been wearing padding and someone had stripped it away. Rachel noticed the change immediately. She said I seemed more present, more engaged, but also more sad. I told her that made sense because now I could actually feel things instead of floating through them. They started me in group therapy the next week. 6 other people sitting in a circle, all of them dealing with trauma that had messed up their lives in different ways. One woman had been in a car accident that killed her husband. She'd convinced herself for 2 years that he was just away on business. A guy my age had watched his best friend die in Afghanistan and started believing he was his friend, living his friend's life back home. Their stories were different from mine, but also exactly the same. We'd all created ways to survive things our minds couldn't handle. The therapist leading the group asked each of us to share what our coping mechanism had been. When it was my turn, I explained about Jake Stevens, about building an entire identity to escape being Jerry Williams. A few people nodded like they understood completely. The woman who'd lost her husband said she got it. She said people on the outside thought her delusion was crazy, but to her, it had made perfect sense. It was the only way she could get out of bed in the morning. Hearing that helped. I wasn't some unique freak. I was just someone who'd survived the only way I could. Rachel came to one of my sessions alone, without Dr. Harrison. Just the two of us in a small room with comfortable chairs. She'd been thinking about everything for weeks. She said she'd made a decision. She was staying. Our marriage would continue. I started to argue, to tell her she didn't have to do this, but she cut me off. She said Jake Stevens might not have been fully real, but our relationship was. My love for her was real. The life we'd built together was real. Those things didn't disappear just because I'd been using the wrong name. She knew it would be hard. She knew I was still figuring out who I was. But she wanted to be part of that process. She was committing to supporting me through integration, even though she admitted it scared her. I cried for the first time since the hotel room, not the confused, panicked crying from before. This was different. This was relief and gratitude and grief all mixed together. She held me while I cried and didn't say anything. Just let me feel it. We started going on dates, real ones, where we both showed up as our whole selves instead of playing roles. The first one was dinner at a restaurant we'd been to a dozen times as Jake and Rachel. This time I went as Jerry, or whatever I was becoming. I ordered different food than I usually did, talked about things I'd never mentioned before. Rachel watched me carefully, like she was meeting me for the first time. In some ways, she was. Afterward, we walked through the park near our apartment. She asked me what I remembered about our first date, the original one 5 years ago. I told her the Jake Stevens version, the story I'd always told. Then I admitted that I didn't know how much of it was real. Maybe I'd constructed that memory too. She said it didn't matter. We were making new memories now, ones we both knew were real. That's what counted. We held hands and kept walking. It felt different from before. More solid somehow. I tracked down the social worker who'd handled my case after the tragedy. It took some digging through old records, but I found her name and number. She was retired, living in Florida. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. She remembered Jerry Williams immediately. She said she'd thought about me over the years, wondered what had happened to the little boy who'd survived that horrible night. I told her I was alive, that I'd built a life, that I was married. She cried on the phone. Then she said she had records, files she'd kept even though she probably wasn't supposed to. She'd always hoped I'd reach out someday. She mailed them to me. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived. Inside were reports, assessments, notes from foster families. Reading through them felt like looking at someone else's life. But it was mine. It was always mine. The records showed I'd been placed with 4 different foster families between ages 8 and 12. None of them lasted. The families all said the same things in their reports. I was withdrawn, difficult, wouldn't talk about my past, had nightmares every night, refused to respond to the name Jerry. The 3rd family mentioned that I'd started insisting people call me Jake. They'd thought it was a phase. By the 4th family, I was fully living as Jake Stevens. I'd created an entire backstory. When the social workers asked about it, I'd gotten upset and defensive. Eventually, they'd stopped pushing. The adults around me were just relieved that I seemed to be improving, even if it was based on a complete fiction. Reading those reports, I could see exactly when I'd built Jake. Age 12. Right after the worst foster placement, the one where the dad drank and yelled and reminded me too much of my real father. I'd needed to become someone else. So I did. Dr. Harrison helped me process what I'd learned from the records. She said, creating Jake wasn't weakness. It wasn't craziness. It was one of the most creative survival strategies she'd ever seen. A 12-year-old boy with no resources and no support had figured out how to protect himself from unbearable pain. I'd built an entire identity, complete with memories and personality and history. That took incredible strength and intelligence. Most trauma survivors just shut down or acted out. I'd constructed something. She said I should be proud of that, not ashamed. The fact that I'd survived at all was remarkable. The fact that I'd thrived, built a career and marriage and life, was extraordinary. I'd done that. Jerry had done that, using Jake as a tool. Now I just needed to integrate them, let them become one whole person, instead of two fractured pieces. I went to the cemetery on a Saturday morning. Rachel drove me. I hadn't been there since the funeral, 20 years ago. I barely remembered that day. It was all fog and confusion in my memory. Now I stood at 3 graves in a row. Robert Williams, Catherine Williams, Jennifer Williams, my father, my mother, my sister. The names were carved in gray stone. I touched each one, traced the letters with my fingers. Rachel stood back, giving me space. Memories came flooding in, real ones this time. My mother's laugh, the way she'd sing while cooking dinner. My father's hands, big and gentle, before the depression took over. My sister's obsession with butterflies. She'd wanted to be a scientist who studied them. She was only 6 when she died. I stood there for a long time, just remembering. Not the horror of how they died, just the love I'd felt for them when they were alive. That love was still there, buried under 20 years of running. I told them I was sorry. Sorry for forgetting them, for pretending they'd never existed. Sorry for becoming someone else instead of honoring who they'd raised me to be. But also, I thanked them for being my family, for loving me before everything went wrong. Rachel stood beside me at those 3 graves, her hand in mine. I told her about my mother's cooking, the way she hummed old songs while chopping vegetables. I told her about my father before the darkness took him, how he'd carry me on his shoulders through the park. I told her about Jennifer, only 6 years old, who collected rocks and believed every butterfly carried a secret message. Rachel listened without interrupting, just squeezed my hand tighter when my voice broke. We stayed until the sun started setting, until I felt ready to leave them there and carry them with me instead. Dr. Harrison's office felt different now. The same beige walls, same comfortable chairs, but I saw it all with clearer eyes. She asked how the cemetery visit went, and I told her it hurt, but in a good way, like cleaning out an infected wound. She nodded and said, "That's exactly what healing feels like sometimes." We spent the session talking about Jake Stevens, about the boy I'd created to survive. She kept saying I needed to stop calling it a mistake or a weakness. Creating Jake was brilliant, she said. A 12-year-old with nothing figured out how to protect himself when no adult would. That took creativity and strength most people never develop. I'd built an entire person, complete with history and personality. That wasn't crazy. That was survival. She wanted me to forgive myself for needing Jake, for spending 20 years as him. I asked how I was supposed to forgive myself for forgetting my real family, for pretending they never existed. She leaned forward and said, "I didn't forget them. I protected myself from unbearable pain the only way I could. My brain chose survival over memory, and that choice kept me alive. Now I could honor them by remembering, by integrating Jerry and Jake into one whole person." She said I should be proud of what I accomplished, not ashamed of how I accomplished it. The memories started coming back in pieces after that session. Good memories I'd buried along with the trauma. My mother's laugh, bright and sudden, usually triggered by something silly my father said. The way she'd tuck my hair behind my ears and call me her sweet boy. My father teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway, his hands steady on the seat, his voice encouraging when I wobbled. That was before the depression got bad, before the medication stopped working, before everything fell apart. Jennifer playing her made-up games, always casting herself as a princess and me as the dragon she had to defeat. She'd whack me with a cardboard sword, and I'd fall down dramatically while she giggled. These memories hurt because they reminded me what I'd lost, but they also felt like reclaiming something precious. For 20 years, I'd pretended these people never existed. Now I could remember them as they really were, not just as victims in a tragedy, but as my family who loved me. Rachel and I sat at our kitchen table one evening, both nursing coffee that had gone cold. She asked if I'd thought about telling people the truth, about who I really was. I said I'd been thinking about it constantly, but didn't know what to say. How do you tell your friends you've been lying about your identity for 2 decades? She suggested we didn't have to tell the whole truth, just enough. We could say I'd recovered memories from childhood trauma, that I'd been in foster care after my family died. that I'd blocked it all out until recently. That was true without getting into the complicated parts about Jake being a constructed identity. People would understand trauma and repressed memories. They didn't need to know about the dissociation unless we wanted to share that. I asked if she thought people would feel betrayed, like I'd been deceiving them. She said some might, but real friends would understand I'd been protecting myself. We decided to start with close friends, test how they reacted, then figure out what to tell extended family and co-workers. We told Rachel's father first because I'd always called him Dad, and he deserved to hear it from us directly. We drove to his house on a Saturday afternoon. He made coffee and asked what was so important we needed to visit in person. I told him my real name was Jerry Williams, that I'd survived a family tragedy as a child and created a new identity to cope. I explained about the therapy, the recovered memories, the integration process. He sat there staring at his coffee cup for a long time. Finally, he looked up and asked if anything about me and Rachel was real. I said my love for Rachel was the most real thing in my life, that Jake Stevens might have been a construct, but my feelings were genuine. He said he felt betrayed, like he'd welcomed a stranger into his family. Rachel started crying and said I wasn't a stranger. I was still the same person who'd married his daughter and treated her well. Her father stood up and said he needed time to process this, that it was too much to take in. We left without resolving anything. Rachel cried in the car and said she was sorry, that she'd thought he would understand. I told her it was okay, that he had a right to feel however he felt. Over the next few weeks, he called a few times. We had long conversations where I answered his questions honestly. Eventually, he said he was trying to understand, that it was hard, but he could see I hadn't been trying to deceive anyone. He asked if we could start over, get to know each other with this new information. I said I'd like that. Dr. Harrison started preparing me for discharge. She said I'd made remarkable progress in integrating my identity and processing the trauma. I'd be continuing therapy as an outpatient, seeing her twice a week at first, then less frequently as I stabilized. I asked if I was ready to leave, if I could handle real life without the hospital structure. She said I was as ready as anyone could be. Integration wasn't something that finished. It was ongoing work I'd do for the rest of my life. But I had the tools now, the awareness, the support system. I'd know when Jerry was surfacing, and I'd know how to handle it without losing myself. I told her I was nervous about going home, about facing normal life after everything that had changed. She said nervous was good. It meant I was taking this seriously. Overconfidence would be more concerning. The hospital had been a safe place to fall apart and rebuild, but real healing happened in the real world. My last day in the hospital, Dr. Harrison suggested I write letters as a way to mark the transition. She said many patients found it helpful to write to the people or identities they were leaving behind. I sat in my room with 2 pieces of paper. The first letter was to my original family. I wrote to my mother, father, and sister, told them I was sorry for forgetting them, but I remembered now. I thanked them for loving me, for the good years before everything went wrong. I promised to honor their memory by living fully, by not hiding anymore. The second letter was to Jake Stevens. I thanked him for protecting me when I couldn't protect myself, for giving me a life when I thought I couldn't survive. I told him he wasn't a mistake or a lie. He was the strongest part of me. I wasn't killing him off. I was integrating him, making him part of my whole self. Dr. Harrison read both letters and said they were perfect. She filed them in my records and said I could come back and read them whenever I needed to remember this moment. Rachel picked me up from the hospital on a Thursday morning. We drove home in her car, and I watched familiar streets go by with different eyes. Everything looked the same, but felt different. Our house sat at the end of the block, the blue door I'd painted last summer, the garden Rachel had planted. We walked inside, and I stood in the living room, taking it all in. The furniture we'd chosen together, the photos on the walls, the life we'd built. It was all real. The love, the memories, the home we'd made. Jake Stevens might have been a construct, but this life wasn't fake. I'd built it with my own hands, made it with my own choices. Rachel asked if I was okay, and I said I was. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was actually standing in my own life, instead of watching it from behind glass. The name change paperwork took 3 weeks to process. I filled out forms at the courthouse, paid fees, provided documentation. When the judge approved it, I walked out with papers that said Jerry Stevens. Not Jerry Williams, not Jake Stevens, but something in between. Rachel said it felt right, like I was honoring both parts of myself. I updated my driver's license, my credit cards, my work ID. Each time I signed Jerry Stevens, it felt more natural. I wasn't choosing one identity over the other. I was becoming whole. Quentin called 2 months after I got home and invited us to dinner at his place. I'd told him everything over the phone, the whole story about Jerry Williams and Jake Stevens and the integration. He'd listened without interrupting, then said he was glad I'd trusted him with the truth. Now he and Fiona wanted us over for a meal, wanted to hear more if I was comfortable sharing. We showed up with wine and flowers. Fiona hugged me and said she was proud of me for doing the work to get healthy. We sat around their dining table and I told them about my childhood, about my real family, about the night everything changed. I talked about creating Jake, about living as him for 20 years, about the breakdown that forced integration. They asked questions, but not invasive ones, just enough to understand. Quentin said something that stuck with me. He said he'd always sensed I was holding something back, like there was a wall between us. Now that wall was gone. He said he was glad to know the real me, even though it was complicated. Fiona agreed and said, complicated was fine. Everyone was complicated in their own way. We stayed late, talking and laughing, and when we left, I felt lighter than I had in months. The trauma therapist's office smelled like lavender and old books. I sat on a gray couch across from her desk, staring at a box of tissues I knew I'd need. She asked me to start from the beginning, from that night when I was 8. I told her I remembered hiding in the closet, hearing my father's voice getting louder. I remembered my mother crying, my sister screaming. The therapist wrote notes and asked me what I felt about my father now. I said I didn't know how to feel about someone who killed my family, but also gave me life. She said that was normal, that survivor's guilt mixed with anger mixed with love was complicated but okay. We spent weeks working through those feelings, digging into memories I'd buried under Jake Stevens. Some sessions I cried so hard I couldn't drive home. Rachel would pick me up and hold my hand in silence. Other sessions I felt nothing, just numb and tired. The therapist said both reactions were part of healing. She asked me to write letters to my father, to my mother, to my sister. I wrote them, but couldn't read them out loud for months. When I finally did, my voice shook so bad the therapist had to help me finish. She said the pain meant I was processing real trauma instead of hiding from it. Progress felt like torture most days. Rachel and I started couples counseling 3 weeks into my trauma therapy. The counselor asked us both what we needed from each other. Rachel said she wanted to support me, but didn't want to become my caretaker, didn't want our marriage to become about my disorder. I said I wanted to be fully present with her, not performing Jake Stevens or disappearing into Jerry Williams. The counselor helped us set boundaries about when Rachel should push me to talk and when she should give me space. We practiced communication exercises that felt awkward at first, but got easier. Rachel admitted she sometimes resented me for creating Jake, for making her fall in love with someone who wasn't entirely real. I told her I understood and didn't blame her. The counselor said resentment was normal, but we had to work through it together. We talked about trust, about how Rachel had to trust I was being honest now after years of unintentional lies. I had to trust she wouldn't leave when things got hard. Some sessions ended with us holding hands. Others ended with us sitting in separate chairs, not looking at each other. The counselor said marriage after trauma integration was hard work, but possible if we both committed. 4 months after leaving the hospital, I drove to my childhood neighborhood. The house where it happened stood on a quiet street with big trees. It looked different now, painted blue instead of white, with a new porch and updated windows. A family lived there, kids' bikes in the driveway. I parked across the street and just stared. Rachel sat beside me, not saying anything. I remembered running through that yard as a kid, my sister chasing me. I remembered my mother calling us in for dinner. I also remembered the night everything ended, the sounds that came from inside. A woman came out the front door and waved, probably wondering why we were sitting there. I waved back and drove away. Rachel asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know, but I was glad I'd come. Seeing the house real and renovated made the past feel more real too, not just nightmare memories, but actual events that happened in an actual place. I went back 3 more times over the next few weeks, each visit getting easier. The last time, I got out of the car and walked up to the yard. The woman who lived there came out and I told her I used to live there as a kid. She invited me inside, but I said no. Just standing outside was enough. I found a support group for childhood trauma survivors through my therapist. They met Tuesday nights in a church basement, folding chairs arranged in a circle. The first night I went, I almost turned around and left. But I forced myself to walk in and sit down. There were 8 other people, all adults who'd survived terrible things as kids. One woman had been in foster care after her parents abandoned her. A man had survived a house fire that killed his siblings. Another woman had witnessed domestic violence that put her father in prison. When it was my turn to share, I told them about Jerry Williams and Jake Stevens. I expected judgment, but got understanding instead. Several people said they'd done similar things, created new identities or personas to escape their trauma. One guy said he'd pretended to be someone else for years before therapy helped him integrate. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone, less broken. After the meeting, 3 people came up to talk to me privately. They said my story resonated with them, that they understood the shame of not being who you thought you were. I started going every week. Some meetings I talked a lot, others I just listened. Either way, I left feeling less isolated. During one of my regular sessions, I asked Dr. Harrison why everything fell apart 6 months ago. She pulled out her notes and reminded me that my adoptive father had died around that time. I'd forgotten that detail, blocked it out maybe. She explained that his death brought up unprocessed grief about my real father, about the complicated feelings I had toward him. The stress cracked the walls between Jake Stevens and Jerry Williams. She said dissociative barriers often break down under extreme stress, especially when that stress relates to the original trauma. Losing another father figure triggered memories and emotions I'd been suppressing for 20 years. I asked why Jerry came back instead of me just remembering the truth. She said my mind created Jerry as a personality because he represented the boy I was before the trauma, the innocent kid who didn't deserve what happened. Jake Stevens was who I wanted to be, but Jerry Williams was who I actually was. The stress made those identities clash instead of staying separate. She said integration meant accepting both, not choosing one over the other. Understanding the trigger helped me make sense of the timing. It wasn't random that I fell apart when I did. Sitting in my therapist's office 6 months after the hospital, I had a realization that changed everything. Jake Stevens wasn't entirely false. He was the person I might have become if the tragedy hadn't happened, the life I wished I could have had. Creating him wasn't just about hiding from trauma. It was about survival, about building a future when my past was unbearable. My therapist nodded and said that was exactly right. She explained that integration didn't mean killing Jake or pretending he never existed. It meant accepting that Jake was always part of Jerry, a protective aspect of my personality that helped me survive and build a good life. The love I felt as Jake was real. The friendships were real. The accomplishments were real. Only the backstory was constructed. She said many trauma survivors do something similar, reinventing themselves to escape unbearable memories. Some change their names legally. Others move far away and start over. I'd done it internally, creating a whole new identity while staying in the same body. Understanding this helped me forgive myself for the years I spent as Jake. I wasn't lying or being fake. I was surviving the only way I knew how. 6 months after my hospitalization, I sat across from Rachel at breakfast and realized I felt different. More solid somehow, more present. She noticed too and said I seemed more authentic lately, more like myself. I asked which self she meant, and she smiled, said she meant the integrated version, the one who wasn't performing or hiding. I still had hard days when the trauma felt overwhelming. Some mornings I woke up confused about who I was, but those moments passed faster now. I could recognize them as temporary disorientation instead of complete identity crisis. My outpatient therapy sessions went well. My therapist said I was making remarkable progress, that integration usually took years, but I was doing the work consistently. Rachel and I were closer than we'd been in months, maybe years. She said I listened better now, engaged more fully in conversations. I wasn't disappearing into my head or switching between personalities. Work was going well too. My colleagues had accepted my name change without much fuss. A few asked questions, but most just updated their contact lists and moved on. I felt stable in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, before everything fell apart. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she was proud of me. I started writing about my experience 8 months after leaving the hospital. At first, it was just journal entries, trying to make sense of what happened. But then I thought maybe sharing my story could help other trauma survivors understand that extreme coping mechanisms didn't mean they were broken beyond repair. I wrote about Jerry Williams and Jake Stevens, about dissociation and integration, about the long road to healing. I shared it on a trauma survivors forum online, nervous about how people would react. The response surprised me. Dozens of people commented, sharing their own experiences with dissociation and identity confusion. Some had created alternate personalities. Others had repressed memories for decades. Many thanked me for being honest about the messy reality of recovery, for not pretending it was easy or straightforward. A few people sent private messages asking for advice or just wanting to connect. I responded to as many as I could, sharing what had helped me and what hadn't. Writing about it helped me process everything, too. Putting the experience into words made it feel more manageable, less overwhelming. Rachel read what I wrote and said it was powerful, that I wasn't sure about that yet, but I kept writing anyway. Quentin called one evening and asked if we could meet for coffee. We sat in a busy cafe downtown, both of us nursing lattes. He said he'd been thinking a lot about my story, about what I'd been through. Then he told me something that surprised me. He said knowing my real story had actually made our friendship deeper. I asked what he meant. He explained that he'd always sensed I was holding something back, like there was a wall between us that he couldn't get past. Now that wall was gone. He understood why I'd seemed guarded sometimes, why certain topics made me uncomfortable. He said he felt privileged that I'd trusted him with the truth, that he knew the real me now instead of just the performance. I told him I was grateful he'd stuck around through everything. He laughed and said of course he stuck around. That's what friends do. We talked for 2 hours, about everything and nothing. It felt easy in a way our conversations never had before. When we left, he hugged me and said he was glad I was doing better. I believed him. Rachel and I started visiting my family's graves every few weeks. The cemetery was quiet, old trees providing shade over weathered headstones. I'd found their graves through county records, 3 markers in a row. Robert Williams, Catherine Williams, Jennifer Williams, my father, my mother, my sister. The first time we went, I couldn't speak. I just stood there staring at their names carved in stone. Rachel held my hand and waited. The second time, I brought flowers and told them I was sorry for forgetting them, for pretending they didn't exist. The third time, I told them about Rachel, about my life, about how I'd survived. I said I was trying to honor their memory now instead of running from it. Rachel squeezed my hand, and I kept talking, telling them about therapy and integration and learning to be Jerry Stevens instead of Jake Stevens or Jerry Williams. I told them I missed them, that I wished things had been different. I told my father I understood he'd been sick, that mental illness had taken him from us before the violence did. I told my mother and sister I was sorry I couldn't save them. Rachel started crying beside me. I put my arm around her and we stood there together, the living honoring the dead. We went back every few weeks after that. Sometimes I talked to them. Sometimes I just stood quietly. Either way, it felt like coming home. Dr. Harrison's office felt different now. The same leather chair, same desk, same framed degrees on the wall, but my relationship to this space had changed completely. She closed my file and looked at me with what I'd learned to recognize as her pleased expression. She told me we were moving to monthly sessions instead of weekly ones. I'd made enough progress that she felt comfortable reducing our time together. The words should have scared me, made me feel like I was losing my safety net, but instead, I felt ready. She said I'd done the hard work of bringing together the different parts of myself and dealing with what happened when I was 8. I still had things to work through, but I wasn't going to fall apart anymore. I wasn't standing on shaky ground pretending everything was fine. I was actually stable now, built on truth instead of lies I'd told myself for 20 years. Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table after dinner, her hand resting on mine. She brought up having kids someday, not as a definite plan, but as a possibility we could actually talk about now. Before, I would have changed the subject or made a joke to avoid the conversation. Now I told her I was scared. I explained that I worried about passing on mental illness or trauma to a child, that I didn't know if someone who'd created an entire false identity could be a good parent. She listened without interrupting, then said, we'd handle whatever came up together. She reminded me that lots of people with difficult pasts become great parents because they understand pain and know how to help their kids through hard times. I asked if she really believed that, or if she was just trying to make me feel better. She squeezed my hand and said both could be true at the same time. I believed her, which felt like its own kind of progress. The courthouse was busy on a Tuesday morning, people moving through metal detectors and checking directory boards for their courtrooms. I stood in line at the records office with my paperwork in hand. The legal name change process had taken 3 months of filing forms and waiting for approval, but today I was picking up the final documents. Jerry Stevens, not Jerry Williams, which felt too connected to that terrible night, not Jake Stevens, which had never really been me. Jerry Stevens was something new, a combination of who I'd been and who I'd become. The clerk handed me the updated birth certificate and social security card, both showing my new legal name. I signed the receipt with my real first name for the first time in over 20 years. My handwriting looked different somehow, more confident. I felt like I was taking back something important that I'd lost when I was 8 years old and decided Jerry Williams had to disappear. My first day back at work with my new name felt strange. I'd sent an email to the team explaining I'd legally changed my name after recovering some family history information, keeping it brief and professional. Most people just nodded and started calling me Jerry like it was no big deal. A few colleagues asked questions over lunch, curious about what had prompted the change. I gave them a simple version about discovering details about my biological family and wanting to honor that connection. They seemed satisfied with the explanation and moved on to talking about their own lives. What surprised me most was how much better I worked now. I'd always been competent at my job, but I'd been using so much energy to maintain the Jake Stevens performance that I hadn't realized how tired I was. Now I could focus completely on my actual work instead of making sure I remembered which stories I'd told, which people, which version of my past I'd shared. My boss even commented that my productivity had improved and asked if everything was okay at home. I told her everything was actually better than it had been in years. Rachel and I stood in the same spot where we'd gotten married 5 years ago, but everything felt different now. Quentin and Fiona stood beside us as witnesses, both of them smiling. The ceremony was simple, just the four of us, and an officiant at a small garden venue. Rachel wore the same dress she'd worn to our original wedding, and I wore a new suit because my old one didn't fit the person I'd become. When the officiant asked for our names, I said Jerry Stevens clearly and without hesitation. Rachel said her full name, and I noticed she was crying a little. The vows were the same ones we'd used before, but this time I was completely present for them. At our first wedding, I'd been performing being Jake Stevens, focused on playing the role correctly. Now I was just myself, saying words I actually meant to a woman who knew exactly who I was. When we kissed, Quentin clapped, and Fiona took pictures on her phone. Afterward, we went to dinner at a nice restaurant, and I felt more married than I had after our big ceremony with 100 guests. This was real in a way that first wedding hadn't been, because I was real now instead of pretending. I posted my story on a trauma survivors forum late one night, using a throwaway account. I'd spent 6 months writing it, trying to explain what it felt like to discover your entire identity was something you'd created to escape unbearable pain. I described the dissociative episodes, the intervention at the hotel, the slow process of accepting that Jake Stevens had never really existed. I talked about integration and therapy and learning to be Jerry instead of hiding behind a fake name and fake memories. I hit submit and closed my laptop, not expecting much response. The next morning, I had 47 comments and 23 private messages. People shared their own stories of dissociation, of creating alternate identities, or losing time, or feeling like they were watching their lives from outside their bodies. Some had been diagnosed with disorders similar to mine. Others were still trying to figure out what was wrong. Almost everyone thanked me for being honest about how messy recovery actually was, for not pretending I'd figured everything out, or that integration had fixed all my problems. One person wrote that reading my story made them finally understand their own experiences weren't unique or crazy. Another said they were going to show it to their therapist because they'd never been able to explain what dissociation felt like. I spent hours that day responding to messages, connecting with people who understood in ways most people never could. Dr. Harrison's office felt full of memory now. I'd spent so many hours in this room working through the hardest parts of my life. She told me this would be our last regular session. I was doing well enough that I didn't need weekly therapy anymore, and she thought continuing would actually hold me back from living my life fully. She said I'd done the difficult work of putting myself back together successfully. I wasn't Jake Stevens pretending to be okay, or Jerry Williams hiding from trauma. I was just Jerry, someone who'd survived something terrible and managed to build a good life anyway. She said most people never achieve the kind of integration I'd reached. I asked if I'd ever be completely normal, if I'd ever stop thinking about what happened. She smiled and said normal was overrated and that remembering what happened was actually healthy. The goal wasn't to forget or to pretend it never affected me. The goal was to live with it without letting it control me. I stood in our living room holding a framed photo of my original family. My mother, father, and sister smiled at the camera, frozen in a moment before everything fell apart. Rachel came up beside me and wrapped her arm around my waist. The wall in front of us held pictures from both parts of my life now. My childhood family next to photos of Rachel and me. Jerry Williams's third-grade school picture beside our wedding photos. I'd stopped hiding my past, stopped pretending those people never existed. Looking at all the pictures together, I felt something I hadn't felt in over 20 years. Peace. Real peace. Not the fake calm I'd maintained as Jake Stevens by refusing to think about anything difficult. I wasn't pretending anymore, wasn't performing a role, wasn't hiding from my own history. I was just living as my whole self, someone who'd been through trauma and come out the other side. Rachel kissed my cheek and asked what I was thinking. I told her I felt like I'd finally come home after being lost for 2 decades. She said she was glad I'd found my way back. I looked at the photos again and realized she was right. I was home.